right, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for a training over racial trauma and cultural betrayal with Maria Escalante here today. I'm super excited to have this conversation with Maria as far as getting to know this information, right? And being able to apply it to our practice. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into the logistics for Agents of Change. We are ASWB approved, and we're also NBCC approved. So if you're a social worker, LMFT, LCSW, of course, LPC, you all are welcome to gain these credits here with Agents of Change. And who you see on your screen today is myself, Bonnie, on behalf of Agents of Change. I do have a social work background and have worked with various populations from foster youth to clients with substance use, from children to adults, and also just serving clients all over the US at this time. Um, and in this, it's so important for us to be aware of this. So I hope that just like me today, you get to take away something from our training today to apply to your practice or wherever you're at. And so without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our presenter today. Maria is an LMFT and also an LPCC. So we're super excited to have her today. She's also been an adjunct lecturer with continuing education providers specializing within trauma-focused and client-centered care. So we'll be getting into that today. Also be getting into EMDR techniques, specifically around our topic, which you can see her experience around all of these things. As far as EMDR, IA certified therapist and approved consultant in training. Some of the additional experience that Maria has is brain spotting, flash techniques, cognitive processing. And so we're really excited to learn about your professional experiences and personal experiences around all of these things when it comes to racial trauma and cultural betrayal, when it comes to our experiences as clinicians and serving our clients. So let's go ahead and get into it here. Would you like to share anything before we move forward on our discussion?
I think it'll probably just come out in the discussion.
Yeah. All right, really excited here. So we're going to go ahead and get started with learning what is racial trauma. So if you can share with me, when we use this term racial trauma, what is it that we are describing clinically?
Yeah, so if we start with terminology, because these terms can get used interchangeably. So racial trauma is a clinical construct. Uh, there's no DSM diagnostic code, although there is research on race-based traumatic stress, but it is something that describes a psychological injury that arises from being exposed to racism. So within that field, that concept, there's a few more specific terms. So you've got work by Shelley Harrell, and she has a model of racism related stress, which is distinguishes several different types of exposure. So there's discrete racism related life events like microaggressions. There's vicarious racism from being exposed to others being victims of oppression. And also vicarious racism is the harm you take on through these exposures, plus there's the daily micro stressors. There's also the chronic contextual stress that comes from like the structural conditions around race and oppression. And then there's the collective experiences that may have been directed to your group, transgenerational transmission. So that's the work of Shelley Harrell. There's also the work of Robert Carter, and he also worked on race-based traumatic stress, and he narrowed the focus. And what he's describing is the emotional and psychological injury that follows an encounter with racism, that the person that is the recipient of that appraises as negative, it was sudden, and it follows, it's outside their control. And a more recent complex racial trauma framework emphasizes that the defining feature is often repetition and accumulation inside a system that is oppressive, that has an us versus them, and it's more than just one event.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. That's really important for us to be aware of these things. So thank you for sharing the insight on those two individuals. As clinicians, how is it that we can distinguish the broader construct of this, as far as racial trauma from a PTSD diagnosis that is in the DSM?
Yes. Okay. So PTSD is obviously, as you know, it's a specific DSM-5 TR diagnosis. It's in the ICD-10, and the places these two things meet is what they call the criterion A. Like if you open up a DSM or ICD-10, there it follows the clinical interview, and then it has these qualifiers. So what is in criterion A is the requirement of being exposed to an actual or threatened sense of potential death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So that can be exposure that's either direct or through witnessing it in person, or through learning that it happened to a close family member or friend, and that event was violent, accidental, or through repeated exposure to adversive details in the course of your professional personal duties. Like vicarious trauma happens, it can happen more with, like, say, caregiving professions. It excludes media exposure unless it's work related. So that is kind of where the intersection lies. The feature is it is because trauma can be a single event, it can be a cumulative event, but with race-based traumatic stress, the particular incident of the trauma originates from a feeling that is based in this sense of racial aggression.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's so important to share these parts because, as you mentioned, that racial trauma isn't in the DSM to follow through, or, that guideline that we
Mhm.
have, as you were saying, but we also have PTSD to look at and see the differences from those two. But as we see on our slides too, today, some of the things that we're talking about is that cultural betrayal trauma.
Mhm.
So I'd like to kind of define this as well, as it's on our screen.
Okay, so when I was researching to prepare for the show, the theory of cultural betrayal trauma was developed by Jennifer Gomez, and it also includes the work of Jennifer Freyd's betrayal trauma theory into the socio-cultural context. So betrayal trauma theory holds that when harm is perpetrated by someone you depend on, the psychological consequences differ from harm by a stranger. Similarly, in developmental needs meeting strategy, which also uses bilateral stimulation, which is in EMDR as well, they talk about two types of trauma. There's trauma of things that happen that shouldn't have happened, and then there's things that didn't happen but should, which is more what they say is about attachment trauma, where didn't get it to in parenting, did not ever feel safe. So that is kind of the earliest roots of betrayal trauma when it comes to the attachment wounds. And it's distinct from the kind of harm you would get from a stranger because, and I think that criterion, that not being aware of of what makes betrayal trauma distinct, I think is something that is a focus on with a lot of the EMDR trainers or trauma trainers that focus on betrayal trauma, because sometimes one of the consequences is there is still a need to function and preserve an attachment because the person needs it, they need it to survive. Now, when we take in cultural betrayal trauma, that theory asks what happens when that dynamic operates at the level of a community instead of rather than a dyad, like a parent-child, siblings, but a whole collective being betrayed by another collective. So I think that's cultural betrayal trauma operates beyond just the individual.
And I would assume at that cultural betrayal, it being a community, this would be coming from various individuals to, let's say, our client.
Yes. So, for example, when you think of societal trauma refers to the things that are oppression. So, discrimination, violence, historical and ongoing structural harm, or lack of access to institutional or societal power, right? And that is all directed at a othered or minoritized group. So in response to that condition, the group that is the target develops what Gomez calls intracultural trust. So this is a sense of solidarity that functions protectively against societal trauma, and cultural betrayal is the violation of that trust. So cultural betrayal trauma is within group interpersonal violence in minoritized communities. And it's understood as carrying an additional harm because the person who caused it was a member of the group whose solidarity was doing protective work. I sometimes suspect that, you know, groups that were traditionally colonized for many centuries, that betrayal within the group, I think, still permeates in the generations that have followed.
Thank you for sharing that. I like the differences between these two. For the clinicians that are listening in today, can you share with us how do you assess that your client is or has experienced the racial trauma versus cultural betrayal? What are some of the questions you would ask?
So one of the questions that I would ask would be, like getting a sense of what were the key incidences, what were they in terms of their location socially, like where did this happen, what was their family of origin. I'm looking to hear whether they were in what one would say was an other group, and whether there was something about their appearance that made them a target through no fault, like it's no one's fault what they look like, right? Um, when it's when it's the in-group betrayal, I tend to ask like who was doing it, and usually what emerges is that in the latter, where it is the intergroup betrayal, it is often people that are close to them, like close family, grandparents, a sibling. So, sort of an example of this that I've come across is fairly frequently is somebody that they were first generation and their parents were from a non-white background, and they moved to a particular part of the United States or Canada that was not particularly diverse at the time they grew up, and so they grew up hearing being called certain things because they look different. That is more because they were the targeted. Another really common one is, and this is like, this is kind of what I mentioned, like people that come from backgrounds where their ancestors were colonized, and it is, for example, like in the Philippines, they were under Spain for 400 years, and there is colorism in it's still present in the society because you I'll hear people say that they'd grow up and someone would, a close family member would make comments about their appearance, and it would be often something that you would not expect them to say, such as, why are you so short, or your nose is too flat, or pointing out physical appearances that are like, well kind of what would you expect, right? And off, or alternatively praising, say, a sibling or a cousin because they looked more like the conqueror. So those are kind of like common themes I see.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think depending on the culture, where the client's coming from, um, we tend to hear this in language as well, right? Whether
Yep.
that be a label, or nickname of any sort, that's coming. So definitely assessing for that as well. So thank you for sharing that. Um, and on this, I do want to get into why this topic is so important for us to address with us today. And we'll also get into our learning objectives. So here, just sharing that today, you all are going to recognize some of the racial trauma that we've been getting into, the cultural betrayal, and how these two things can influence safety, identity, belonging, trust, especially emotional well-being and clinical symptoms, which we're already starting to understand here with those definitions and understanding how to assess or have a conversation around this with our clients. We'll also be able to contextualize by being able to consider the systems around racism, discrimination, and as you mentioned, right, is this something that's coming from within a family, within people that they know and are comfortable with, or is it coming more from a group setting of the community? So this cultural context, as well as intersected experiences of marginalization when assessing trauma, and this therapeutic relationship. So I think within that too, assessing, the right fit for the client, the correct language for the client of how we're speaking to the client, the right resources, and if we're having paper resources or digital resources, making sure all of that, is in the framework for the clients as well. And lastly, too, here is as clinicians, it's important for us to understand how to respond to our clients. And Maria has a lot of experience here with EMDR. So we will be getting into that, as far as informed stabilization, the resource development, treatment planning, and culture humility, while also honoring present day realities and ongoing threats that our clients can experience. So really understanding these three parts here. All right. So into that, before we specifically touch and talk about EMDR, what does culturally responsive trauma assessment and treatment require from a clinician?
I think, cultural humility, cultural competency, that's kind of an ongoing discipline, right? You can't know everything, and you can never predict if you're going to be working with a population that is going to be new to you. So I think one is like a bit of curiosity, actually a lot of curiosity. I think that people can be exposed to different things, but they may never receive the benefit of being exposed to those different things. I think one of the things too is knowing that you will have a blind spot. So culturally responsive treatment also acknowledges that there are going to be, when people say I'm not biased, I think that is I think it's an aspirational statement, but everyone, if you're human, you're going to have a bias. So I think being able to be willing to be aware and maybe even hear a blind spot being pointed out. And some of the things that when I recently did a presentation with the NASW California, and we did talk about culturally responsive EMDR. One kind of the key feature in even treatment planning that's culturally responsive is, and it's a bit of a pivot, is the harm's not necessarily gone. So if somebody has grown up where they are routinely profiled by the police and they've never had any they've not been involved in anything that would remotely require that, that is not going to go away. You can have a lot of EMDR sessions, but fundamentally, when they step outside, that could still be there. So I think one of the key things with culturally responsive trauma treatment is the acknowledgement that it's not truly a past tense. Not the same way that somebody who had trauma because they were in Hawaii and there was an earthquake or there was the volcano erupted, and they got to safety. That is definitely in the past. So part of the modifications per se would be something around acknowledging safety within the context that we live in. So it expands the trauma history explicitly and not implicitly. And that involves what they call culturally humble history taking. So that includes perhaps the RBTS, the race-based traumatic stress assessment, to get a baseline, including in the treatment planning and the target sequencing for EMDR treatment planning, incidences of racial trauma, historical trauma, in addition to the standard history, asking explicitly about experiences of racism, discrimination, systemic oppression, and also exploring what is that client's cultural beliefs about mental health, mapping the intergenerational narratives and community histories that are shaping feelings of distress, but also feelings of resilience.
Yeah. And these conversations can be uncomfortable for some, or maybe coming from the clients. So, what are some of your tips to continuing this conversation or maybe identifying, okay, this is where we might need to pause for the safety of the client?
Yeah, so for example, some culturally responsive questions are something like, what stories are passed down in your family or community about survival and resilience? Or, how has, racism or discrimination shown up in your life? If there's an opening during, say, an intake, or how does how does your culture understand emotional distress and trauma? Or who or what has helped you and your family survive difficult times? So those are some sample questions. There's also like some categories that are really helpful to explore, such as is there immigration or acculturation stress? Because another thing about culturally responsive trauma treatment is that don't base it on what the person looks like, because there are people who would literally pass for white presenting, but that's not been their experience, and that is not what they identify with, and that's actually not what they are. So it one has to be curious, because it might be easy to actually think that they always grew up in the United States, for example. So I think looking at immigration and acculturation stress right now is really important, but also identifying cultural strengths and resources is equally, if not more important.
Yeah, thank you. Is there something that you have at hand to kind of remind you of this and to ask these questions for every client? Because sometimes we tend to maybe get in the rhythm of things and get comfortable and don't ask. So do you have any tips and tricks to remind ourselves of that?
I think what has really been helpful is I don't know if you've ever worked for Kaiser, but Kaiser, their intake form is really comprehensive, and it really does a good job of cueing the therapist, especially if you're early in your career, of key questions. So one question that is open-ended but can give you a lot is, how would you describe growing up? Or were you born and raised in California, or did you move around? Things such as, is there any particular religious or spiritual practice or cultural tradition that you feel really resonates and is important for me to know? It's a lot of like inviting questions. I think we can take someone's social history. You can find out, like, did they grow up with both parents? Are they the oldest in a family of four? That's all great, but I think understanding their, like, mapping their geography, and also mapping, like, one question of, do you know of or do you suspect that there might be close relatives that could have had a mood disorder? And that kind of opens up, like, someone will say, my one side's always been anxious and this is kind of what they went through. So I think it's important to kind of listen for cues, and some of those questions that I just said, they can easily open the door, because were you born and raised in California? That's not necessarily a yes or no question. And even if someone says no, I wasn't, then the follow-up question is, oh well, where did you grow up? So you want to know, you want to map their location and where were they in the context of the social and community life that they grew up in.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. So important for us to ask as we move along in our assessments, especially from the very beginning,
Yeah.
um, and do that research, right? To ensure that we are making a comfortable setting for a client, but also bringing in that cultural part to it. So, with this, for clinicians who are familiar with EMDR, what does the informed part or protocol teaching framework contribute to understanding racial trauma and cultural betrayal?
So EMDR has the 8 phase adaptive information processing model, or AIP model. So there's what they call standard EMDR, and where a culturally responsive EMDR is adapting all those 8 phrases from a culturally humble, history taking, to liberation centered cognitions, interweaves, and closure. So in a way, it is working with the person's own history. So it's still doing the 8 phases, but it's incorporating kind of that historical piece to it. So, for example, if we look at AIP through the cultural and racial lens, and if memory networks hold trauma, they also hold race, identity, culture, and historical context. So, you want to look at cultural beliefs. What beliefs shape how events are encoded and interpreted. So that's kind of where you can identify cognitions that are helpful versus non-helpful. Target sequencing. So racial trauma targets are often under-identified in sort of the standard therapy, standard EMDR, because microaggressions, things such as people who there's also that term reverse racism, right? But like racism is racism. But there's also individuals who they may be white, but where they grew up, they were actually the minority, so they had the exact same experience. So sometimes, again, it could be underreported because maybe now they're here and now they're the majority, but they grew up where they were not and they were treated as such. Other things too in target sequencing is collective events such as community violence, protests coming, having grown up in a regime and having to escape. That can function as trauma targets and often can be triggered by things like social media, news stories, things that are not they're not pleasant to listen to, but they can have an impact that may be missed. So then the AIP model, when it is being culturally responsive, it has to include almost like call out the elephant in the room: racism, colonialism, and all the historical injustices that were done in a person's whole family line.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. And that we see here on our screen those differences here of what we can discuss with our clients and what is it that we're not doing within those clinical settings as well. So we'll continue to discuss this here as we break down EMDR and that informed part and of course, culturally responsiveness here. So with this, when it comes to trauma therapy, often it helps clients to recognize when past dangers are no longer occurring.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to racism and discrimination, that might be still very real. Just like you gave that example earlier, where in the past we experienced something over and over and over again, and we can work through EMDR, but it still might be present. So here, how is it that we help someone regulate their nervous system without asking them to minimize any legitimate threats?
Yeah, so I think the most useful shift that I can offer is to assess what they call the functional impact of stress. So, and that's stress across life domains rather than just working from a symptom checklist. So, racism related injury can show up in occupational functioning, whether someone feels that they can advocate for themselves, whether they feel they have a right to take up space in a meeting, how they can tolerate feedback from a manager. It can show up in healthcare engagement, where there are statistics about different outcomes based on demographics, like that. There's whole research is there. It can also show up where maybe even avoiding medical settings is part of a way of coping, but then it'll have physical consequences. It can show up in someone's ability to engage in their academic life, to participate in civic life. If it influences their parenting decisions, it can influence where they choose to live, where they're willing to be after dark. So those are symptoms that we may not miss because on the surface it looks like, well, maybe they just don't like to go out as much, or maybe they like to stay close to home, but not really. And again, really know thy client, right? So when the threat is ongoing, it's important to name that. And the sense of identity and the sense of self-worth is kind of where if the threat's ongoing, that's what distinguishes the material that clinically is that the injury attaches to something that the person cannot change and would not want to change. So one of the things I looked up when I was preparing was the work of Kenneth Hardy, and he talks about the wounds of racial trauma. where it's like an internalized evaluation, an assaulted sense of self, a feeling of internalized voicelessness, and this rage that has nowhere legitimate to go. Now, please note that like that's a clinical framework that was developed from his practice, not from a validated measurement model, but it names things that we do see in practice. And I think internalized racism, kind of like internalized homophobia, is important almost explicitly to have in an assessment because it operates at the sense of self rather than belief, which is distinct because it's like positive cognitions, negative cognitions is about belief. But the actual self concept is even below the level of belief. It's about how the person relates and transacts in the world. And that's not something that the person really will ever voluntarily share because it's not even necessarily conscious.
Yes, and something that might be shameful to share, we've been built around it being an uncomfortable conversation or not to say. So it can be difficult to bring up in a session, especially the previous question to ask. Um, what is mental health for you and your culture? Is this
Mhm.
comfortable for them or not comfortable for them? So how much are they actually sharing? How much is the truth? So that's also important. So thank you for sharing that. Really insightful information there. Um, and with this too, how can clinicians incorporate the cultural strengths, their community, spirituality, maybe even their family values, collective identity into EMDR informed trauma work?
So this is where I would say the cultural strength and collective resources are key. So in EMDR, there's something called the RDI, or the Resource Development Installation. So when it comes to resource development in trauma treatment that's culturally responsive, it means deliberately building and strengthening internal states and images that a client can access, that they feel connected to, so that they're available before and during sessions when they're out in the world. And nothing about that requires the resources to be generic. So when when resources are derived from the client's own cultural world, they tend to be more vivid, more emotionally available, and more durable. So, for example, being Catholic is also cultural as much as it's religious, and depending on what country it's practiced, it takes on aspects of the environment it's in. But if someone grew up very, very Catholic, right, Irish Catholic, right, Italian Catholic, very just both from a culture as well as a religion that is maybe more conservative, and they found great strength in prayer. Something like I'm trying to think of a good example. So something like there's a tradition of the novena in the Catholic tradition, and a lot of the novenas are based on the lives of saints and saints that came from different parts of the world. So, like certain figures that are really connected to their culture, that can represent safety in a way that resonates at a profoundly deep level. That the regular, think of a safe place such as a park bench, it cannot compare.
Yeah. And can you give an example of how you incorporate this into a session to show or, I guess, have that warmth of safety to open up?
All right, so I'm going to pull from what I was presenting because a lot of what came up was really, really kind of, in my opinion, original. So, for example, when we're identifying cultural strengths and resources, you know, notice what the client's cultural practices, what specific practices have supported the sense of survival and resilience. What are spiritual, ancestral, and communal resources that are clinically relevant. So, for example, the safe, calm place, adapt that to some meaningful cultural imagery, such as, you know, like certain traditional clothing that they wear. So something that is sacred, that is really unique to that person's culture, could be the grandmother's kitchen. It could be the temple, could be sacred spaces. It could be, you know, there is there's an ocean deity from, I think, based in the Caribbean, called Yemaya, and there's people that would give offerings for in the ocean, and it looks like they're having a beach party, but they're not. But I think Yemaya is the great mother, kind of like the mother bear energy, and like that can really resonate from someone. Ancestral blessings, certain cultural rituals, and you know, symbols like the rosary, or symbols such as the Buddhist prayer beads, like, or even just wearing sort of wearing a belt that has multicolored beads on it that are sourced from a certain region. Like it on the surface, you wouldn't realize how much that is significant. So other things when people could use is include ancestors in the safe, calm place, spiritual figures, cultural symbols, culturally familiar grounding, prayers, chanting, dance, spiritual dance, drumming. So you want to co-create resources that feel authentic, not generic, and not imposed.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And so I think a lot of this can go hand in hand with the skills and tools that they can take with them by doing our research, as we're all tuning in right now, right? Really learning about these things generally. And hopefully this opens your eyes to really learn about your client and integrate these things that would be more comfortable and safe to really open up and do that healing in that. So thank you. And so, with this as well, how can intersecting experiences of marginalization and privilege shape the way racial trauma is experienced, how it's understood, assessed, and treated?
Yeah, so intersectionality, that's an analytical framework. And it, it's interesting how we can have these sort of paradoxical experiences. So the Asian minority model myth, right? It's somebody that they are they're not white, but they sometimes can look like they're white adjacent apparently because, oh well, you must be really smart. Oh, you can help me with my math homework. So it's almost like on one hand you've got this card you can play, but on the other hand you're still not feeling like you completely belong. So intersectionality, it describes the systems of oppression and how they can operate simultaneously and produce experiences that you can't understand by examining just one side. So, because in certain contexts, you're the oppressor, and other contexts, you're the you're the recipient of oppression. So that when it comes to intersectionality, I think it's important to again realize that nobody is really a textbook case, right? So if somebody has a disability, but it's a disability you can't see, and if they're neurodivergent, you can't really see it. And in the case of women, women mask way better than men, but it can affect how a person's reaction can be interpreted if they're fatigued, if you know they're they, they're not able to mask much longer. Also, things such as how a person is, how immigration status. I know in California we can't really ask that anymore, right? But immigration status can determine whether someone feels safe accessing help, which is kind of where the sanctuary city policies came from, was because there were people that were victims of crime and they wouldn't cooperate because they were afraid, and it was to facilitate them having access to safety and resources. Language. So language is such an interesting thing because yes, we speak English, but I can fly to London and I can go to Glasgow, and there are certain words that have a totally different meaning, even though I recognize that word. In the case of Spanish, when the World Cup was on, there were certain phrases, and it's like the Madrid accent. When those Spanish players were talking, I was like, I can understand you. I don't need to look at the subtitles as much. And it reminded me, like, as the tournament went on, I would hear people say things about there's this hierarchy of like when you speak Spanish, their Spanish is the best Spanish. Like it's like where's this coming from? Because it's kind of like we in the English speaking world we don't do that. At least I haven't I haven't heard people have the same reaction to people with those with the British accent. So it's interesting how language can affect how a person is perceived in terms of class. So accent, language, how they use language, their you know, if the way you talk can place you in a certain geographic zone, it can change how people look at you. And I think the intersectionality is particularly interesting and worth being attuned to as much as possible. Is that as much as we think the United States is really multicultural, go to Jamaica because you will see people that look Asian and they'll have and but they're totally Jamaican. And I think that's a type of intersectionality I think we're not as aware of because it's very easy to assume so much about a person just by what you think their life has been because they look a certain way.
Yeah, most definitely. And a lot of things are like clicking here. And I hope that for people who are listening also can put puzzles and pieces together, whether it be from your clients or even personal experiences that we can have click that go into the office.
Yeah.
And that's huge. I know I had a certain individual share with me, this was a colleague who was Asian, and they mentioned in my area, we're mainly Hispanic. So mentioning how she was always getting the question of not receiving help, whether it be in a store or a restaurant, because people automatically assume that that's where she was coming from, although she was born and raised here, and felt that she was like brought into this culture of Hispanic and knew Spanish and knew English.
Mhm.
And she's like, I don't really identify with my own culture besides what I brought from home. Um, so it is so important to bring these questions to our clients and maybe even within the coworker setting too, right? Be aware, culturally aware of these things as well. So thank you for sharing that. With this too, I wanted to ask a question because we were getting a little bit into the neurodivergent clients.
Mhm.
Um, at times also maybe our gifted learners as clients or perfectionism. So with these clients, what are some clinically important intersections that you see with racial trauma?
Yeah, that's a that there can be some really unique qualities. So I think the error when it comes to differentiating, gifted or divergent perfectionism, trauma presentation is that you can't attribute everything to a single cause because perfectionism and overachievement, if you look at it closely, there's kind of like this, you know, potential to stereotype. So, for example, there's perfectionism OCD, and then there's situational pressure that can lead someone to perfectionism. There could also be acculturation stress where maybe at home you've got parents that are like pushing, pushing, pushing for performance, and you developed the belief that that's your value, and you must always perform, versus also feeling that you must live up to some kind of expectation because you must be good in math, which is like no. So not all the presentations look the same, and kind of where neurodivergence intersects, and it does it in a couple of ways. So there are diagnostic disparities, and that has been documented in research because someone that is decided that they are if they're given a diagnostic let me rephrase. So autism or ASD and ADHD, they are not necessarily diagnosed at the age that you think they should be, like when they're kind of 10, 11, 12, about to go to middle school. They tend to be identified later in women and less often. So later and less often in women and people of color. because the same behaviors that are displayed by somebody that is female, somebody that is a person of color versus a white boy can can have different responses. Often the child of color might get a disciplinary response while a white boy will get an assessment. I mean, that also can depend on like location, the school district. So if someone who's been both racialized and neurodivergent, they could be doing like double masking at the same time. So the combined cognitive load is, it's not necessarily additive, but it is an increased stress. Other things too that if, again, women, they tend to mask better than men apparently, but things such as if they seem like their affect is flat, or they have like the eye contact, they don't sustain the eye contact, especially when they're younger, or the literal interpretation of what is said, as well as their delayed processing, that can be misread, and combine that with racial stigmatization. It could be misread as, oh, they're being evasive, they're being hostile, which is like, again, would it be read the same if it was a white presenting child? So, the recovery trajectory from that intersection of the neurodivergence as well as the racialization after numerous discriminatory encounters can look different. The person may need longer processing time. They may need more explicit instructions rather than just assuming that they're going to infer what just happened. They might just have a harder time with social ambiguity that which actually can characterize microaggressions. So like there's social ambiguity kind of can make the situation right for microaggressions that they don't catch. And they don't understand why are people doing this continuously, because they're not catching the cues. Not to their own fault, but again, if intervention happens sooner, then that social learning would have happened sooner too.
Most definitely. And also thinking of development, right? And the stages of development, especially within that age of 10 to 12, with all of the changes that
Yeah.
this stage is experiencing. So taking all of that into consideration, but also lack of resources or misunderstanding of those changes in development along with all of that. So thank you for sharing that. Um, on this as well, what do you wish more mental health professionals understood about healing from racial trauma and cultural betrayal?
I wish it's so different for each person, but I think first and foremost, maybe knowing that this is a thing. Like it really is a thing. You know, a lot of people talk about the colorism. Well, colorism is not, it's not new. It is not unique to one group, and it is still going on. I think also another thing that probably would be helpful is knowing that there are a lot of very unique pairings that can occur in the population. So it's like everyone assumes, for example, that everyone in say Italy, Portugal, Spain are all kind of Catholic, which for the majority they are, but there is a large sort of minority in, say, Portugal, people that are Jehovah's Witnesses that were discriminated against by their own people. I mean, the more you know, or people assume that everyone that is from Iran is Muslim, and it's like, no, actually, they have a very, very ancient Jewish population because they were originally Zoroastrian. They were not originally Muslim, right? Or I think other things that I wish people would be aware of is just the vastness of history. So when people think of someone that is Russian, they don't all look Slavic. If you go as far as Siberia, they look kind of Asian, right? Or if you go to parts of, I mean, like, I'm a polyglot, so I think this is really fascinating that there are people that could literally walk through an airport and they will not be stopped by Homeland Security because even though they're Afghani, they look Scottish. And that's not that unusual because there's a whole region in parts of the Middle East where the people have blue eyes and golden hair, and that's natural. So it'd be nice if people could see the varieties that exist in humanity a bit more, just because it is quite interesting and also more likely to kind of really get the person more than just what could be a projection.
Yeah, most definitely. And thank you for sharing that because I think it's so important to be aware of. There's just so many mixes and like the time of what we appear to be as opposed to what we truly are, or even depending on our client, if they've moved so many times or maybe experienced a move and that's their main area of what they know. So that's what they identify with, and it's so important to assess for that. So I really appreciate you sharing this with us today, and I hope that the clinicians sitting in, this is something that really opens your eyes, and something to take away is just, are we asking those questions, right? Of, um, you know, having cultural awareness, cultural humility from the beginning of when a client steps in. Um, and in this too, asking some of the questions of, they might be able to identify as Catholic or religious in some way, or maybe some other things, right? But specifically asking, what parts of that do you accept or identify with? Because there's so many changes now in shifts where it's like, oh, just this or just that, or a mix of these two things. So thank you so much for giving us this insight to be culturally aware of these two things with that context of EMDR as well. So, is there anything else that you would like to add here on our presentation?
Um, I would say that there's some really good work being done, especially with EMDR on being culturally responsive. I mean, it is a work in progress. So with EMDR in particular, so a couple things that I brought in that the my last CE is that culturally responsive, culturally rooted resourcing. So one again is exploring cultural and ancestral sources of safety and strength, co-creating really unique, kind of customized images that resonate with that person. There's also, when it comes to targeting racial trauma, it's not always incidences where one was profiled, although that happens a lot, but it's not the only. There's the overt and then there's the covert. So, the overt would be, slurs, profiling, microaggressions, workplace discrimination. But then there's also the covert, such as the feelings of shame about the one's appearance, you know, language, identity. For a time, apparently back in the 80s, there were people that were making a lot of money teaching people, like they were voice coaches, teaching people how to lose their accent, which, what was that about? Because as long as people can actually understand you, that's all that matters. And a lot of the people were quite articulate. Other things that with EMDR on the negative cognitions. So often standard negative cognitions may not incorporate or show the awareness of the systemic oppression. So it's important to identify what can we adapt the negative cognitions if they are to be aware that there is systemic oppression. So beliefs such as my voice doesn't matter in this system, I am not safe in these type of spaces, I have to be perfect to be tolerated, and my culture and family are inferior, which is, where does that come from? I mean, that's not something, no one's born with that thought. But then on the other hand, also it's important to adapt positive cognitions, which is centered on liberation and not necessarily assimilation to the oppressive norms. So something like my worth is not defined by racism. My people and I are resilient and powerful. Often they are because of if you look at historically, they had to endure a lot, or things such as even just the validation of like the harm is real, but my reactions make sense. I deserve safety, respect, and care regardless of how I'm treated. And there's also bilateral stimulation with cultural sensitivity, where you can discuss the meaning of eye contact, right? And then cognitive interweaves that explicitly name racism, such as this happened because of racism, not because you were too sensitive. Your fear and anger make sense in a system that targets people like you. It was not your job to educate them or prove your humanity, and the problem was the racist system, not your worth or intelligence. And cognitive interweaves that include ancestral and collective strengths, such as your ancestors survived so much, their strength lives on in you. You can honor your pain and also honor the resilience of your people. Those are examples. So that's kind of how you can adapt the EMDR protocol to be more culturally sensitive. And also there's EMDR for racial profiling, which does not require you to say, oh, it's done now, because no, it's not.
Yeah, most definitely. There's lots of work to be done here, and I really appreciate you and your time around this, as far as your work and sharing this with us, because I really hope that it does open your eyes to this and hopefully learning some more, being aware of the questions that we're asking to our clients, the conversations we're having, and keeping those conversations in something that, yes, it might be uncomfortable, but making sure that we're providing the right services and being aware and, like you said, curious, right? Really approaching this with curiosity to better serve our clients. So
Oh, and
thank
one more thing I will add too is that if somebody speaks another language, like there's it's not uncommon to, like, I know what you're saying, but my vocabulary, my verbal recall is not there, but I know what you're saying. I think even if you there's not that comfort in like the verbal exchange, as long as the client can feel that they can say it in their native language, because so much is coded, I think even that alone is validating, because they're not having to translate, which is, that's increased cognitive load.
Yes, most definitely. Sometimes it can definitely be so much easier to express our emotions
Yeah.
and what we're helping our clients with in our own native language or what we're most comfortable with, primary language. So definitely always addressing that as well. So thank you. Anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I think that's kind of it for now. I do have my every Sunday at 5 o'clock Pacific time. I have my drop-in EMDR consultations for certification. So for people that are EMDR trained and they want to be certified, that is every Sunday at 5. And I incorporate the culturally responsive lens. And one of the things that I like to really focus on is this notion of the perpetrator interjects, where a lot of times if somebody was exposed to an unsafe figure that was constantly saying very negative things growing up, some of the negative beliefs they have could not even be their own. And if somebody grew up being othered, that's unfortunately a common childhood experience. But it's also important to work with that too, to kind of remove the power of the perpetrator interject.
Yeah. And where can we find that information if anyone wants to log on to that?
So it is on my website at www.exposuretherapydesigns.com, and you can send me a message, and there's a section on EMDR where people can register. So yeah, basically it's drop in, and we do it by Zoom. So you don't necessarily have to live in California, but any questions that people have after this interview, they're more than welcome to reach out and ask.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully, all those who are interested and EMDR trained are open to getting more information and learning more about this to apply to their practice. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Our key resources are here on the screen as well, and we will be sharing any materials here within the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or click the link in the description to purchase the course and earn your CE certificate. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You get unlimited access to more than 200 ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses and more than 20 live events each year for one low annual fee. We're always adding new and exciting courses. Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.